All right. This is the chapter The White-Tailed Deer from the book Outdoor Pastimes of an American Hunter by Theodore Roosevelt. The white-tailed deer. The white-tailed deer is now, as it always has been, the most plentiful and most widely distributed of American big game. It holds its own in the land better than any other species because it is, by choice, a dweller in the thick forests and swamps, the places around which tide of civilization flows, leaving them as islets of refuge for the wild creatures which formerly haunted all our country. The range of the whitetail is from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and from the Canadian to the Mexican borders, and somewhat to the north and far to the south of these limits. The animal shows a wide variability, both individually and locally, within these confines. From the hunter's standpoint, it is not necessary to try to determine exactly the weight that attaches to these local variations. There is also a very considerable variation in habits. As compared with the mule deer, the whitetail is not a lover of the mountains. As compared with the prongbuck, it is not a lover of the treeless plains. Yet in the Alleghenies and the Adirondacks, at certain seasons especially, and in some places at all seasons, it dwells high among the densely wooded mountains, wandering over their crests and sheer sides and through the deep ravines. While in the old days there were parts of Texas and the Indian Territory where it was found in great herds far out on the prairie. Moreover, the peculiar nature of its chosen habit, while generally enabling it to resist the onslaught of man longer than any of its fellows, sometimes exposes it to speedy extermination. At the beginning of the rut, the does flee from the bucks, which follow them by scent at full speed. The white-tailed buck rarely tries to form a herd of does, though he will sometimes gather two or three. The mere fact that his tactics necessitate a long and arduous chase after each individual doe prevents his organizing herds as the wapiti bull does. Sometimes two or three bucks will be found strung out one behind the other, following the same doe. The bucks wage desperate battle among themselves during the season, coming together with a clash, and then pushing and straining for an hour or two at a time, with their mouths open until the weakest gives way. As soon as one abandons the fight, he flees with all possible speed and usually escapes unscathed. While head to head, there is no opportunity for a disabling thrust, but if, in the effort to retreat, the beaten buck gets caught, he may be killed. Owing to the character of the antlers, whitetail bucks are apt to get them interlocked in such a fight, and if the efforts of the two beasts fail to disentangle them, both ultimately perish by starvation. I have several times come across a pair of skulls with interlocked antlers. The same thing occurs, though far less frequently, to the mule deer and the wapiti. The whitetail is the most beautiful and graceful of all our game animals when in motion. I have never been able to agree with Judge Catton that the mule deer is clumsy and awkward in his gait. I suppose all such terms are relative. Compared to the moose or caribou, the mule deer is light and quick in his movements, and to me there is something very attractive in the poise and power with which one of the great bucks bounds off, all four legs striking the earth together and shooting the body upward and forward as if they were steel springs. But there can be no question to the infinitely superior grace and beauty of the whitetail when he either trots or runs. As soon as game became less plentiful, my hunting had to be done on foot. My object was to be on the hunting ground by dawn, or else to stay out there until it grew too dark to see the sights of my rifle. Often all I did was to keep moving as quietly as possible through likely ground, ever on the alert for the least trace of game. Sometimes I would select a lookout and carefully scan a likely country to see if I could not detect something moving. On one occasion, I obtained an old whitetail buck by the simple exercise of patience. I had twice found him in a broad basin, composed of several coulees, all running down to form the head of a big creek, and all of them well timbered. He dodged me on both occasions, and I made up my mind that I would spend a whole day in watching for him from a little natural ambush of sagebrush and cedar on a high point which overlooked the entire basin. I crept up to my ambush with the utmost caution early in the morning, and there I spent the entire day, with my lunch and a water bottle, continually scanning the whole region most carefully with the glasses. The day passed less than it sounds, for every now and then I would catch a glimpse of wildlife. Once a fox, once a coyote, once a badger, while the little chipmunks had a fine time playing all around me. At last, about mid-afternoon, I suddenly saw the buck come quietly out of the dense thicket in which he had made his midday bed, and deliberately walk up a hillside and lie down in a thin clump of ash where the sun could get at him. For it was in September, just before the rut began. There was no chance of stalking him in the place he had chosen, and all I could do was to wait. It was nearly sunset before he moved again, except that I occasionally saw him turn his head. Then he got up, and after carefully scrutinizing all the neighborhood, moved down into a patch of fairly thick brush where I could see him standing and occasionally feeding, all the time moving slowly up the valley. I now slipped most cautiously back and trotted nearly a mile until I could come up behind one of the ridges bounding the valley in which he was. The wind had dropped, and it was almost absolutely still when I crawled, flat on my face to my crest, my hat in my left hand, my rifle in my right. There was a big sagebrush conveniently near, and under this I peered. There was a good deal of brush in the valley below, and if I had not known that the buck was there, I would never have discovered him. As it was, I watched for a quarter of an hour and had about made up my mind that he must have gone somewhere else when a slight movement nearly below me attracted my attention, and I caught a glimpse of him nearly 300 yards off, moving quietly along by the side of a little dry watercourse, which was right in the middle of the brush. I waited until he was well past, and then again slipped back and with utmost care, and ran on until I was nearly opposite the head of the coulee when I again approached the ridge line. Here there was no sagebrush, only tufts of tall grass, which were stirring in the little breeze which had just sprung up, fortunately in the right direction. Taking advantage of a slight inequality in the soil, I managed to get behind one of these tufts and almost immediately saw the buck. Toward the head of the coulee, the brush had become scanty and low, and he was now walking straight forward, evidently keeping a sharp lookout. The sun had just set. His course took him past me at a distance of 80 yards. When directly opposite, I raised myself on my elbows, drawing up the rifle, which I had shoved ahead of me. The movement, of course, caught his eye at once. He halted for 1 second to look around and see what it was, and during that second, I pulled the trigger. Away he went, his white flag switching desperately, and though he galloped over the hill, I felt he was mine. However, when I got to the top of the rise over which he had gone, I could not see him, and as there was a deep though narrow coulee filled with brush on the other side, I had a very ugly feeling that I might have lost him, in spite of the quantity of blood he had left along his trail. It was getting dark, and I plunged quickly into the coulee. Usually a wounded deer should not be followed until it has time to grow stiff, but this was just one of those cases where the rule would have worked badly. In the first place, because darkness was coming on, and in the next place, because the animal was certainly to die shortly, and all that I wanted was to see where he was. I followed his trail into the coulee and expected to find that he had turned down it, but a hurried examination in the fading light showed me that he had taken the opposite course, and I scrambled hastily out of the other side and trotted along, staring into the brush, and now and then shouting or throwing in a clod of dirt. When nearly at the head, there was a crackling in the brush, and out burst the wounded buck. He disappeared behind a clump of elms, but he had a hard hill to go up, and the effort was too much for him. When I next saw him, he had halted, and before I could fire again, down he came. In 1894, on the last day I spent at the ranch, and with the last bullet I fired from my rifle, I killed a fine whitetail buck. I left the ranch house early in the afternoon on my favorite pony named Muley, my foreman Sylvain Ferris riding with me. We forded the shallow river and rode up a long winding coulee with belts of timber running down its bottom. After going a couple of miles by sheer good luck, we stumbled on three whitetail, a buck, a doe, and a fawn. When we saw them, they were trying to sneak off, and immediately my foreman galloped toward one end of the belt of timber in which they were and started to ride down through it. While I ran merely to the other end to intercept them, they were, of course, quite likely to break off to one side, but this happened to be one of the occasions when everything went right. When I reached the spot from which I covered the exits from the timber, I leapt off and immediately afterward heard a shout from my foreman that told me the deer were on foot. Muley was a pet horse and enjoyed immensely the gallop after game, but his nerves invariably failed him at the shot. On this occasion he stood, snorting beside me, and finally, as the deer came in sight, away he tore, only to go about 200 yards, however, and stand and watch us, snorting with his ears pricked forward until, when I needed him, I went for him. At the moment, however, I paid no heed to Muley, for a cracking in the brush told me the game was close, and I caught the shadowy outlines of a doe and a fawn as they scudded through the timber. By good luck, the buck, evidently flurried, came right on the edge of the woods next to me, and as he passed, running like a quarter horse, I held well ahead of him and pulled trigger. The bullet broke his neck, and down he went, a fine fellow with a handsome 10-point head and fat as a prize sheep, for it was just before the rut. Then we rode home, and I sat in a rocking chair on the ranch house veranda, looking across the wide sandy riverbed at the strangely shaped buttes and groves of the shimmering cottonwoods until the sun went down and the frosty air bade me go in. That is the white-tailed deer in um, a chapter in the book Outdoor Adventures of an American Hunter by Theodore Roosevelt.